Welcome to 2025, where arguments between factions of the right may consistently be bigger news than traditional left versus right skirmishes. We'll break down the Musk versus Bannon conflict. We'll take a moment to talk about the legacy of Jimmy Carter, and then we start the new year with a debate that seems to be more cross-partisan than in the past. Does Congress need term limits? Welcome back to the podcast for the 54% of Americans who regularly vote for progress in every election and want to convince their friends and family members to join our majority. This is Majority 54.
Well, Jason, as we're recording, we're learning bits and pieces about this terrorist attack down in New Orleans. One thing that we do know is that one of the perpetrators, there might be multiple perpetrators. There was information circling on the right that this guy was an illegal immigrant, but it turns out he is an American citizen from Texas. I think he might even have been a veteran. There may have been co-conspirators. They're, I think, moving the Sugar Bowl timing. But so we don't really know that much. I don't think there's too much to talk about there. But on the subject of immigration, there is a big topic here to hit, which is this so-called MAGA civil war going on, which began after Trump announced that he was appointing Indian-born tech entrepreneur Shriram Krishnan as a senior policy advisor for AI. This guy came out of the VC world. And the next day, on December 23rd, Laura Loomer, who's kind of like the fringe depending
Racist
on how fringe
lady.
she was actually, she was traveling with Trump. So, it depends on what we call fringe, attacked this pick as deeply disturbing in an ex post and said that career leftists were behind this and that Krishnan was a career leftist. And I think mischaracterized Krishnan's support for what she said was eliminating green card caps, but he actually wanted, I think he wanted to increase the amount and reform the green card program. This led to a dust-up between sort of what we can call the nationalist right. This is what people are calling it. We can unpack whether these are actually truly two distinct camps, but the nationalist right versus sort of the tech right, the tech bro right. So members of the sort of Bannon wing were attacking this guy. And then the VC sort of tech capitalist types like David Sachs, Musk, Joe Lonsdale were all defending the pick. We can get into the line by line, Jason, but do you think this is a real and meaningful rift?
No, I don't, honestly. I mean, I have seen people trying to make a very big deal out of it. I mean, I'm sure it's a somewhat meaningful rift. I'm sure if you're involved in it on the right, it's real in the sense. Now, if you had a lot of these build up over time, I think that could be pretty meaningful. But it basically seems to me like Elon is saying, hey, I bought this. It's my presidency. I'm going to do the things that I want to do with it. And how dare you peons get in the way of me getting a return on my investment, which is pretty much how I see him, right? Because I'm sure uses a ton of H-1Bs at X and at Tesla. And so to him, this is really necessary. And then to the Bannons of the world that are like, this guy's brown. We don't like that. And we don't like more brown people coming. Loomer said, that it needs to be for STEM American. It's like, okay, well, if there were STEM trained Americans who could do these specific jobs, they would do them. You're not taking, isn't that the whole concept of an H-1B? It's like, well, this is the person who can do the job, and we don't have people who can do it here. So, you want to train people better here, fine. That said, you would need in my opinion, a pretty regular cadence of dust-ups like this for it to be really substantial. I think people have been really wanting it to be a big deal.
Well, let me tackle a couple of these items. One is the question of the Indian American sort of debate going on within the right, which I think is super meaningful given the prominence of Indian Americans on the right in American life. I think this is something we might have even talked about, as I joked at various points about how all the energy that goes into anti-Semitism. I've wondered often why people weren't paying attention to the success of Indian Americans. And for people who are new to this podcast and don't really know my name, that I am Indian American myself. So I'm speaking at this from personal experience. There, up until this dust up, you'd really have to work hard to claim that there was an outsized amount of racism towards Indian Americans. There certainly has been racism, but I think we've had a relatively easy go compared to a lot of marginalized groups in this country. That may be changing based on some of the things I'm seeing on the right. So let me tackle that. Then let me tackle the H-1B visa program. And then let me come back around to why I actually think this could be the beginning of something meaningful on the right. So I'm going to take the opposite side of the
All right,
argument for
great.
you,
I
which is
hope
always
you're
fun.
right. Let's hear it.
So, okay, on the Indian American front, it's important to say that there's actually a lot of really nasty things being said on the right about Indian Americans. So there are a lot of these people, blue checkmark types on the right. There's this guy, Patrick Casey, who said, above all else, Indians in America want more Indians to immigrate here. They openly want to grow their numbers, power, wealth, influence as Indians. This is a natural impulse, but is fundamentally at odds with historic conceptions of American citizenship. You could replace Indians with Jews, and that should sound very familiar to
Yeah.
people.
Also, how is it fundamentally at odds with the concept of American citizenship? I mean, like, isn't that kind of what every ethnic group has done over time, with the exception of those who were brought here involuntarily?
It is interesting. I think every group has its own unique kind of flavor, right? I do think Indian Americans and Jews, and Asian Americans generally, and Jews have a very similar trajectory, which is they came in very quickly high skilled, and actually Indian Americans more than Jews, because Jews were coming in garment factories and
right.
things
We
like
were
that in the beginning.
tailors and shoe cobblers, and
Where we had like people like my father and engineers, and now on the tech side of things, you had this whole wave of Indian Americans coming in. And that's certainly what the heart of this debate is about, which is the H-1B visa program, which is by its very nature, which I'll get to, highly skilled workers, which is not how my dad and a lot of the doctors got here, by the way. They came here on green cards because of the Vietnam era shortage of doctors. But they're coming in high skilled. Now, that is not the only Indian American group that comes in. Like, if you've ever noticed, there are a lot of, you think about South Asia generally, there's a lot of Bangladeshis. There are a lot of people, if you notice, working in either your gas stations, your 7-Elevens, your motels, your hotels. And then the Bangladeshis are doing a lot of jobs that other people on the sort of lower education rung Americans are doing. So it's not simple, but people do, I think, they associate Indian Americans with their doctors, now their lawyers, their tech sector, their engineers. And I think that's in part why, unless you're somebody whose job is being taken by those Indian Americans tend to assimilate in a certain way. Like, my dad moved to a small town in Alabama, where he's basically the only Indian American there. He's very popular in town because he was the doctor in town, providing a meaningful service, which is why this is a tough sell, but one that they're trying to make. Another user, this tweet got 1.5 million views. The Indian hustle goes like this. They come here using an H-1B visa to steal an American job. Then they import more like them. They take over middle management, only hire Indians. Eventually they become CEOs. Their only superpower, importing more obedient Indians. Now, I think they get it wrong, which is
so racist.
I think they get it wrong, which is, I don't think Indians are very loyal to Indians. They are as capitalist as they come. They are loyal to they are loyal to the dollar. So they're going to hire whoever the best person is for the job, from my experience. So I think they get that part wrong, which is why I think in part this hasn't been a sellable argument. But there are people, if you remember, Ann Coulter said to Vivek Ramaswamy, she was like, I like you, but I would never vote for you because you're Indian. And, this is my dad, for long-time listeners will know this. My dad is born in India, immigrant, came here, ran as a MAGA Republican in Manhattan. So this is interesting to see how he handles this. Now, Musk, we'll talk about how to handle like this sort of schadenfreude of this whole situation, but Musk has been very pointed on this. He called the members of the GOP hateful, unrepentant racists, contemptible fools. They will absolutely be the downfall of the Republican Party. He told them to go F themselves. I will go to war on issues like this, the likes of which you cannot fully comprehend. Bannon clapped back, saying, please someone notify Child Protective Services. They need to do a wellness check on this toddler. Now, Jason, I want to get this out of the way really quickly. It may be a surprise to listeners that Musk is not completely consistent on this issue. He did come here on an H-1B visa, or at least he spent time here on an H-1B visa. And again, I'll come to in a second what that means. But in November 23, in response to an account accusing Jews of bringing hordes of minorities to the U.S. Musk wrote, "You have said the actual truth." Last December, he posted a misleading graph suggesting illegal immigrants were overtaking domestic births. He's referenced an alleged Democratic plot to, quote, legalize vast numbers of illegals. And a Bloomberg analysis of over 500,000 of Musk's tweets found that there are two issues more than anything else he loves to talk about, which is alleged voter fraud and immigrants, and often he commingles the two. So he has, for all the racism he's saying that, has been, rampant on the right, he has trafficked in it. But I think
also, he's only against these racists because they're keeping him from getting people he needs in his company.
Yes, it's on the bottom line here.
Yeah.
It is the bottom line. Now, I think that we should file this away as, when it's relevant, remember the hypocrisy here. But I do think it's important to independently try to decide what you think on these issues. And then I think you treat the Schadenfreude, like contradictions and all that, as a separate issue, because there is an important debate going on right now about both the visas, the role of Indian Americans in our life, but also what does it mean to be, quote unquote, American first. So let me quickly dispense with the Indian American part of this first, which is Indians are now the second biggest group of foreign-born Americans. That's pretty amazing. Mexicans, of course, being the first. Now, Indian Americans are at the heart of MAGA. Kash Patel has been nominated to be the FBI director. Vivek Ramaswamy is obviously a prominent member of the administration with the Department of Government Efficiency. J.D. Vance's wife is Indian. Now, you probably wouldn't. You'd have to really work hard to remember that, because he doesn't defend immigrants in any way or children of immigrants. And he certainly isn't going to bend over backwards to have anything meaningful to say in this debate. By and large, Americans have a very fond view, have a very positive view of Indian immigrants and of highly skilled immigrants. And those two things are obviously related. A recent Pew poll found that an overwhelming majority of Americans place a priority on letting in highly skilled workers. So I'll pause there before we get to the H-1B front here. I do think that the sort of, as a general matter, the American public is on the side of the sort of the capitalists on this one. Now, that doesn't mean that Trump is going to be fully forcefully with them. He has essentially defended the visa program, but this is just the opening salvo, and knowing Trump, he can go back and forth on this one.
This reminds me a lot of the Republican internal riff over migrants with regard to farmers. It's very similar, right? I mean, like, you have a big block of the Republican Party that is, with the Republicans on a bunch of other things because of cultural issues, right? Like, particularly big corporate farmers who are like with them on taxes and all sorts of other things. But then they use a lot of migrant workers, and they use them seasonally. And so then they're generally not on board with things like mass deportation of migrants. This is just a higher skilled version of that, right?
Absolutely. Now, I think, and I'm going to come back around to the H-1B, but I do think Trump is facing real tensions within his coalition here. And I think he is, because he's spending so much time with the tech elite, he is leaning in that direction, which is a real risk for him amongst the true nativist right within his flank. Like, to give you a few examples, on TikTok, he's explicitly siding with the investor in TikTok who has donated to his campaign. That is not something that the nativist right is going to love. I imagine there's a real risk that he's going to weaken his stance on tariffs. On antitrust, like, there's that whole Hawley sort of Vance wing on the antitrust side of things. Can't expect much there. Section 280, wouldn't expect much there. Deportations, we'll see, right? Like, you got to think that a lot of these people now, Mark Andreessen, Musk, and all that, they're not going to have a lot to say, or might even be supportive of deportations.
They don't care about that.
But there are also, like, you think about meatpacking plants and all these other companies that donate a ton to Republican parties, which frankly, a lot of heinous shit goes on in these places. Those types, I don't know. Like, those people might have a lot to say. And then if you look at his cabinet and the appointees he's made are almost overwhelmingly on the sort of tech billionaire, millionaire right, and are not really drawn, thankfully, I would have to say, from the nativist wing of the party for the most part. Now there is overlap again, like what is Elon Musk? He's a little bit of both, right? So, or a lot of bit of both, right? So I don't think these are clean comparisons, but if I'm in that flank, the Bannon types, there is some reason for those people to think, hey, like this guy is selling us out. Trump has been very durable within those groups, so they're pretty loyal to him. But it is a pretty important trend to keep in mind.
It's an important trend. I wonder how much of it is, hey, we're getting sold out ideologically versus, hey, how come we're not the lead bird in all these spots, right? Like just sort of anytime you have and I mean this figuratively, a revolution, the next thing you have is a resorting of the hierarchy and who gets to be in charge of what. And if they feel like they're not getting to be in charge of enough stuff, they're probably pretty mad about it. And I don't know what that amounts to necessarily.
Yeah.
And like I said, I think it has to happen consistently for it to amount to too much.
Absolutely. Well, let me get into some background on this H-1B visa because I actually think it's really interesting. It reminds me of tariffs in the sense that it's not as neat and clean as you think it is. You take the racism out of this, right? Like the general thing is just because bad people feel a certain way doesn't mean you automatically take the opposite position on that. I happen to take the opposite position, just like in tariffs, but there's a lot of legitimate debate about H-1B visas. So let me get through some of this background on this program. So program begins in 1990 under George H.W. Bush, and it's for highly specialized workers with a bachelor's degree. Right now, there are around 600,000 H-1B visa holders in the country. The vast majority are from China and India, upwards of 2/3 from India. Most jobs are in tech, but companies also use them for certain specialized skills like Spanish language teachers or doctors with special skills. They're good for 3 years with another 3 years renewable. So they're temporary. People usually apply for a green card during the process of being on an H-1B visa, or they marry an American and get a green card that way. Critics say that businesses regularly game the system to pay H-1B visa holders below market wages and exploit foreign workers and stack the deck against American job seekers. And those critics include people like Bernie Sanders and labor. Bernie Sanders previously argued that highly skilled immigrant labor is a potential weapon that business owners use to lower wages. There's some evidence for this. In 2015, Disney famously fired 200 U.S. workers, some of whom said they were made to train their H-1B visa replacements. The AFL-CIO, the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers, have come out against H-1B visas in some form, or at least called for major reforms. When he was a candidate for president, Biden promised to reform them, saying, quote, highly skilled temporary visas should not be used to disincentivize recruiting workers already in the U.S. for in-demand occupations. And he has been kind of back and forth on this as president. He's tried to do some kinds of reforms that haven't really gone anywhere. Both Dick Durbin and Chuck Grassley are co-sponsoring a program to reform the program. I'll pause there because there's more to say here. But just to say, Jason, that this is not a neat right-left issue.
Well, and I can see, it is clear why labor has at sometimes opposed it, because not all of these positions are big engineering positions. Not all of them are doctors and that sort of thing. Like the IT professionals, stuff like that. A lot of those are unionized positions. And even if they're not, they're workers. And that's generally the job of labor, is to fight for people who don't sign the paycheck, but do receive it. And so, they would aspire to organize a lot of these positions.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is. Yeah, I think tariffs is a great example. It's something where we as the left knew exactly what we thought about it for a really long time, and now everything is realigned and nobody's exactly sure where they're supposed to land on this.
Right. And I went through as much as I could find on this program this morning, and the best piece I read was by this economist named Noah Smith, who I've interviewed before. And I'll quote from what he said, because I think he does a really good job of parsing what we know about this program. He says, immigration as a whole doesn't seem to decrease native-born American wages. And that's true. Immigrants don't just work, they also buy stuff. And that increase in demand roughly balances out the increase in supply. But in a specific sector, immigration definitely could decrease wages for the native-born. If you let in a ton of STEM workers, they could drive the price of STEM labor down, while their demand for local goods and services drives up wages in other industries. In this case, American labor as a whole wouldn't be affected, but American STEM workers would get the short end of the stick. Interestingly, though, this doesn't appear to happen in practice. The H-1B visa program involves a lottery system. So by comparing companies whose applicants win the lottery with those whose applicants lose, we get a very good randomized natural experiment that can teach us how the H-1B program changes the fortunes of companies. On top of that, there have been occasional changes in the total number of H-1B visas so that we can look at the results of those policy changes on companies that are more dependent or less dependent on H-1B workers. Any way you slice it, it doesn't look like H-1B workers hurt the native born, even when they seem to be in direct competition. And then he cites 4 different studies that show that. And then he gives 2 explanations for it. One is that potentially the native born workers are doing jobs Americans don't want to do. He thinks there's a more important reason, which he calls industrial clustering, which is the H-1B visa program has attracted some of the most elite talents in these various sectors, Elon Musk being one of them. Like, for all I have to say about him as a person, he is an extremely talented engineer and entrepreneur. The more of those people you let in, the more they start companies, the more jobs are created, the more people want to create jobs there. And Smith cites a paper that basically establishes this, that the more you limit these, the more these companies hire those people outside of the United States. The more you have them, the more they're going to have catalytic effects within the country. So I actually think these are a net benefit. And I'll get to this, but there are other ways to increase this type of immigration outside of H-1B visas, probably better ways to do it.
Well, America has a really long history of being the best by being a place that everybody wants to be, so that the best from everywhere around the world want to do what they do here. I mean, you can't get around that, right? I mean, there's a reason that Tesla is based here and not somewhere else. That, I mean, you go all the way back to like Alexander Hamilton. I mean, it's like, that's kind of Einstein. I mean, that's what happens.
Yes. And, and for all the issues that I have with Vivek Ramaswamy, I thought was fairly forceful and convincing on this front. And I think he had a very interesting way of framing his pushback to the right on this, where he was basically, you're being soft. You don't want to be competed against. This is your DEI, essentially, he was saying.
Mm-hmm.
Like, which again, like, you have to, in the Trump era, you could do what you want, listeners, but I think it is important to try to treat this with a goldfish memory until the election comes, when actually people's history and contradictions matter more than in the line by line, day to day. And so with a goldfish memory, I'm like, okay, that's actually a very helpful thing to say to the right on this particular issue. Now, very quickly, what would I do to this program? Number one, make them more transferable. These people come to this country and they're often tethered to one job, which means that employers can exploit them. 2 is I would make a minimum salary to just like account for whatever people are saying with the driving down wages here. I would raise the cap so more people could use this program. And then I would expand the number of employment-based green cards, which are more permanent and a better program than these. So that's my general sense on the H-1B side of things.
All right. Well, so we'll keep an eye on this to see if this sort of rift happens continually, because if it does, then that is politically more significant. But in the meantime, it's interesting, and it certainly has policy significance. All right. Jimmy Carter passed away at the age of 100.
Yes.
I think you want to start with this quick clip.
Yeah, we have 2 clips. I want to play 2 clips. They're a little on the longer side, but I think it's worth it given who we're talking about here. And given that I think a lot of Americans probably don't have a strong sense, for you and I were not even born when he was president. And I think people don't really have a full appreciation of who he was. So I'm going to play one clip first about the sort of pre-presidential Jimmy Carter.
In time, the newly minted officer rose to the rank of lieutenant in the nuclear submarine service. But he cut short his Navy career after his father's death in 1953 so he could return to Georgia to try to revive the family's struggling peanut farm.
We've always worked for a living. We know what it means to work.
Within a few years, politics beckoned, and Jimmy Carter began his ascent, winning election as a state senator, and then in 1970, governor.
Congratulations, Governor.
He called for the state to transcend deep divisions over race and inequality.
I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over. No poor, rural, weak, or black person should ever have to bear the additional burden of being deprived of the opportunity of an education, a job, or simple justice.
Georgia law then limited governors to a single term. But Jimmy Carter had his eyes on a much bigger prize. On December 12, 1974, he announced he was running for president.
Jimmy who?
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy who?
Outside his home state, candidate Carter began as a virtual unknown. Jimmy Who became a political punchline, even in Carter campaign films. But it was also an asset. Voters had soured on Washington after the Vietnam War and Watergate. And Mr. Carter embraced his outsider status and began climbing in the polls.
I remember when we couldn't find a microphone.
In April 1976, he mused on his appeal in an interview with the McNeil-Lehrer Report, a precursor to the NewsHour.
There's an intensity of commitment to my campaign and a depth of sacrifice among people who volunteer to go all the way to New Hampshire at their own expense, to give up their vacation time, to go back later to Wisconsin. I had over 1,000 Georgians who went into Florida. Other candidates don't have that.
Yeah, I think this is a good example, Jason, of many things, but one is how much can change in a short period of time and how some of our best candidates, Barack Obama was an example of this, Jimmy Carter was an example of this, come out of relative obscurity very quickly to address what the electorate is looking to remedy in the outgoing administration. It's put another way, it's the Gretzky skate where the puck is going type of thought, which is there's all this, like, we need to like address this, and this from the last election, but it's actually looking ahead to say what is to come. And often we don't know really what's going to happen. If you would have guessed at the beginning of Nixon's second term, you probably wouldn't have known that this was what was going to happen, right? Or that Barack Obama, before his address at the DNC, was going to be a credible challenger.
As a former career politician, it's just a reminder that you can plan whatever you want, but there's, as Obama once said, there's so much serendipity involved, right? I mean, if not for that moment in American history being what it was, Jimmy Carter's probably never president of the United States. And you could make the same argument for Obama with the Iraq War and everything. And so it's just always interesting that you can look around at whoever's in your class politically if you're a rising politician, and you can try and figure out who's going to make it, but you can't know because it's all circumstances. I mean, people probably remember Todd Aiken, he almost won a U.S. Senate seat in Missouri, but what people don't know is that Todd Aiken was considered just a wackadoodle, fringe, crazy person when he was in the state legislature. The reason he became a member of Congress is because there was a huge rainstorm the day of a Republican primary in St. Louis County, and he got elected to Congress because it didn't pass over the area where his votes came from. And then, he became a candidate and said some dumb stuff about rape, and then as a result, I was on the ticket and I got to be Secretary of State because of the dumb stuff that guy said. So, like, you never know who's going to rise up at a certain time. And you're right. It doesn't make sense to look backwards. It makes sense to try and skate to where the puck is going.
And, I think put another way also is this presidency, which I think there's a bit of revisionism around his presidency. I think he was a much better president than people give him credit for. Let's go to a clip of some of just like highlights of him talking as president.
It marks a new beginning, a new dedication within our government, and a new spirit among us all.
The energy crisis has not yet overwhelmed us, but it will if we do not act quickly. It's a problem that we will not be able to solve in the next few years, and it's likely to get progressively worse through the rest of this century. It is a crisis of confidence, threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
One of the agreements that President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin are signing tonight is entitled A Framework for Peace in the Middle East.
And the other thing that we must do is to stand with our allies and friends and freedom-loving people around the world and say, we will not go to Moscow and participate in the Olympic Games in your capital. Late yesterday, I canceled a carefully planned operation which was underway in Iran to position our rescue team for a later withdrawal of American hostages who've been held captive there since November 4th. The United States remains determined to bring about their safe release at the earliest date possible. I believe with all my heart that America must always stand for these basic human rights at home and abroad. That is both our history and our destiny.
For context, his canceling of that operation had to do with the fact that two helicopters crashed into each other when they were starting that. So it's not like he was like, hey, we were
one
going
of
to do
the
it.
most unlucky presidents of all time.
Right.
You think about the inflation, the oil embargo, the Iran hostage crisis. But I would say on the issue that I've spent a lot of time on the past few years, which is the Middle East peace effort, we've never had a better president. Like he was by far the most active and engaged, and got really damn close to some really good things, and did broker some important semi-deals there. And there's just amazing footage. There's a PBS documentary, I forget the name of it, but it just goes through like the Camp David Accords and just like all of the, or I don't know if we called those the Camp David, but I think it was Camp David Accords under Carter, and just how active he was and how just genuinely
genuine he was.
Yeah, just genuine. Like,
Yeah.
if we're being honest, like most American presidents are pro-Israel. He was, I think, genuinely like without a,
He hadn't come from national politics. He'd come from being the governor of Georgia, and he just came into it with a really objective, unencumbered point of view. And I think he did that on most things, which is why he probably is one of the greatest examples of a president, at least in the modern era, who went in there without any regard toward getting reelected and was just like, I'm going to do the best job I can do, and did not make his decisions based on how they affected reelection. I mean, like the dude was giving speeches that were like, okay, it's going to be really hard for a while. Like the economy is going to be bad for a while. Inflation is a huge problem. Like he was like, I'm going to keep it real with you. And that, interestingly, I think that brand of politics might work better now than it worked then. Back then, people were just like, no, you tell us what we want to hear. And then it kind of comes to fruition because everybody's on the same page, you know?
Right.
And he was much more like, well, it's going to be bad for a while.
And when we talk about inflation, like I forget what the numbers are, but they're crazy, way worse than anything we just went through. The
gas
mortgage
lines
rates,
and
I think the mortgage, like the average mortgage was double digits in the US at the time. It's like, it's crazy to think about. It was just expensive to do anything in this country back then. Well, rest in peace, Jimmy Carter. And also an example of, back when our, one of our big bases within Democratic Party was rural South.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think about.
Well, and I think it's overdone, but the most important thing to say about Jimmy Carter is like what his post-presidency was like. I mean, the guy spent, 40 years as a former president, and he certainly made the best of those years. I mean, he is the model for what a great post-presidency can look like. I mean, he did so many things, but it also, what's cool about it is it's clear from watching Jimmy Carter that that wasn't like, okay, now that I've been president, what should I do? That was like, Jimmy Carter was like, okay, I was president for a while, now back to doing cool stuff.
Yeah.
And trying to make the world better, which is basically what he would have done anyway, just that he ended up with a former president platform instead of a former governor platform.
He's like Mr. Rogers, Yeah. I think it's interesting because like, I think it tells you a lot about who somebody is, about how they handle the post-presidency, because then a lot of the sort of like the ambition of like getting this office and you finally attain it is stripped away. And then you're like, who are you? So like George W. Bush, I think, is more of an introvert than we realize. He's been painting, doesn't want to be bothered. Bill Clinton is precisely the same person. Like he has never changed. Like he
Bill Clinton's post-presidency is like a guy who's running for UN Secretary General.
Yeah.
I mean, he's not, but like you feel like he is.
Loves the game. You know, he's like Bill Belichick, Tom Brady. You'll have to drag him off the field. Barack Obama is, I think, a confounding example. I think I honestly have wanted more from him. I get why he hasn't but it's just like, I think for him, I think he has struggled to find his place, honestly, like in the post-presidency world. You know?
Yeah, I think Obama would prefer to have something like a Clinton global initiative, and what I think he's doing with what he aspires to do, it seems to me, with the Obama Foundation, is to build something that is uh, indexed heavily on young people in the country, and like reaching into communities and empowering young people, which is really kind of what he's been all about. So it's actually, I would argue, pretty consistent. It's just not as broad.
Yeah, and it honestly hasn't been that effective. I go to a lot of their stuff, and it's just like, I just think he hasn't really put his back into it. And I also think like his unique brand of technocratic sort of leadership, which I generally have fallen into, it just doesn't scale well.
Hmm.
Like that idea of community organizing, like devoid of like a certain kind of like on the ground kind of effort that he just understandably again hasn't put in. I actually think like a better, and he's young enough that this could happen. I think like a sports team owner or the commissioner of the NBA or something like that, like the head of the NCAA. Like he loves sports so much. I almost think like he
Mhm.
benefit from something totally different
Hmm.
that he's also interested in. I think could be a really good path. So Obama, if you're listening, I'm here for it.
Interesting. I think that the Trump presidencies has really interrupted whatever Obama, like, if you think about it, if Hillary wins in 16 and then serves 2 terms, it makes it very clear for Obama what his place is in the
Right.
world. He becomes much more like what Bill Clinton was. Now, Bush got elected, but there was a real relationship and a fondness by that time, between the Bush family and the Clinton family. So you had Bill Clinton, going to North Korea to bring back people who had,
Right.
been imprisoned there under the Bush administration. He became like an envoy and so I think in a Hillary Clinton presidency, you end up with a very active and clear role for Barack Obama, and the Trump presidency with a 4-year interruption of Biden, whereas Biden had been his vice president. So there was a reluctance to ask Obama to engage because it would potentially diminish Biden. It probably has made it more difficult for Obama to find his place in a post presidency.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas
And
like Carter had a good relationship with Reagan even after losing to him, and so Carter was deployed to do things by Reagan and did it happily.
Yeah,
So-
Carter had a weird combination of like this introverted farmer life with like really picking
Mhm.
and choosing his moments post presidency really well. You
Mhm.
know, it's fascinating. It's like Obama is similar in the sense that he has an introverted element to him. Bill Clinton has no introverted elements to him. Like a guy
No.
is only happy when he's around other people.
Mhm.
It's interesting to see how these people are different. Well, okay. Should we talk term limits very quickly?
Yeah, go ahead and set up why we're talking term limits. This is such a weird story.
Well, this Texas Congresswoman Kay Granger, is on her 14th term, but she didn't cast a vote during the shutdown fight and hasn't voted at the U.S. Capitol since July. And, a couple weeks ago, it emerged that she had been suffering from dementia and has been residing at a senior living facility, which neither she, her congressional office, nor House GOP leaders had disclosed to the public.
I think like a reporter found her there, right?
I mean, this is a caricature of our problem in this country, which is that, and this is definitely bipartisan. We have got too many people who are well past their prime in an office, and both Democrats and Republicans have been pointing this out. Ro Khanna, a Democratic congressman, said Kay Granger's long absence reveals the problem with Congress that rewards seniority and relationships more than merit and ideas. We have a sclerotic gerontocracy. We need term limits. We need to get big money out of politics so a new generation of Americans can run and serve. Gotta say, big agree.
Yeah.
Big
Also,
time agree.
I have no idea what sclerotic means. I'll look it up after this, I guess. Gerontocracy, I can figure out from the root words. But and I like Ro. He's a good dude, but like that's a very Bay Area word that he just used.
Yeah. And I honestly didn't look up to see how consistent he has been on this and some issues and big questions that I shall not name that have been at the center of our party, but let me assume he is. And again, like consistency to me is less important to me at the moment than just treating each argument on its own. And I just agree. It's so hard to get people to willingly give up their own power, though. Like you'd have to get people to like term limits. I don't know, Jason. What do you do? How do you get term limits? Increase pay? Say that term limits don't kick in for 20 years? Like, I don't know. Like, where do we go here?
I'm opposed to term limits. So let me, like in general, but first, as a funny aside, I don't know that this person would want credit for it, so I won't name them, but somebody who people would know who listened to the show said to me once that I thought was very funny. They said that U.S. senators should be elected once and then serve for life, but be executed at the age of 75. Which this person was kidding, but his point was like, they'd probably do what's best for everybody if that were the case.
Sounds like Al Franken to me.
It wasn't Al, but anyway, it doesn't matter. Because Al probably wanted to serve in the Senate long beyond that.
And live.
And live. But okay. The reason I used to be in favor of term limits. Before I was elected to the Missouri State Legislature in 2008, I thought term limits were great. We have them in Missouri. We had them then. And looking back, I probably was influenced in thinking they were great by the fact that my opportunity to run for an open seat in 2008 for the state legislature was largely due to term limits. My predecessor, Janae Lowe, had been in office for 4 terms. That's the term limit. And to me, I was like, yeah, of course it makes sense. We get fresh people in there. And then I got down there, and when I showed up, I was very fortunate. They put me on the budget committee right away. So I started asking around. I said, okay, well, I want to learn how to be very effective on the budget committee. Who do I ask? And I thought people were going to give me the name of the budget chair or the budget ranking member or some other member who had, been there a long time. And no, people kept giving me the names of lobbyists who were former members and lobbyists who were not former members. And that was because in order to really understand the process of the legislature, you have to be there a long time. And that means either you're a former member who has become a lobbyist, or you are a longtime lobbyist who has just been around the process so long. So the problem with that is, as I've seen in Missouri, it takes the institutional memory of how the place is supposed to work, and how it actually does work, and it moves it from the chamber where the power is, or chamber where the voting takes place, to the rotunda and to the hallway, to the lobby, if you will. And it therefore moves the power to those places. So I am not like a person who spends a lot of time bagging on lobbyists, like, because they do a job that we allow to exist. And so I used to be a lawyer. I'm not going to blame people for advocating for things. I do blame legislators who set up systems that empower lobbyists in obscene ways. And what I've seen in Missouri is that, the concept was people will just come in and they won't be career politicians, right? That's the idea. That's the idea behind term limits. In this case, we're talking about it as sort of an age-related thing. But the concept for term limits is mostly we should have citizen legislators. And so that's what people thought they were getting in Missouri. But what happened is that you end up with this big donut hole in who serves, because you either get young, super ambitious people like I was. I was elected at the age of 27 to the Missouri State House. So I'm like beginning of my career, don't have kids, can, make the drive to Jeff City, spend tons of time on it, all that. Or you get people who are much older, people in their, 70s, 80s, who are like, well, my kids are out of the house. I'm retired. I think I'm going to do this now. Right. And so there were not a lot of middle-aged career professionals in the legislature. And the ones who were career politicians. And some of the younger people were also career politicians who, when they came up on a term limit, they just immediately went looking for the next office, or more often became lobbyists. And I think that's a huge problem.
What do you think then about, because a lot of these offices have age, they have floors of the age or whatever you call it, like age minimums or whatever. Like you have to be 30 to be a senator or whatever. Like, couldn't we just say 75? That's it. Like, you can go do many other things. Senators, you could go become a professor. You can, if you want, you could be a lobbyist or whatever. But like at a certain point, yes, there are people above 75 who could do the job. But at a certain point, you want to like de-risk the situation and say that these are really important jobs. And you can't have people like Thad Cochran, who I remember because I was spending a lot of time in Mississippi at the time. He was basically doing the same. Like he was kind of tucked away out of sight for years. Yeah. And it was the people around him who were doing the job, and the electorate had no idea what was going on.
I guess you can make that argument, but at the end of the day, to me, the problem is you've also got a lot of great people who are well over that age limit who are still in the job. You can't argue me that Bernie Sanders is in any way diminished, and is not like a super important. I mean, also, I think Bernie Sanders, as far as I can tell, has pretty immense respect on both sides of the aisle in the Senate, and has even a history, and a recent history of working with Republicans on certain things. So for everything you're going to gain, there are things you're going to lose, and there isn't. Now, look, yes, you end up with people who are in the position like Kay Granger, but more often than that, what you end up with is older people who don't have anything to gain and are just like there to do a good job. Like Bernie Sanders ain't running for anything else, So what you're going to get from Bernie Sanders in the next few years is just Bernie Sanders caring about what's best. And that's what you're supposed to get from these folks now. The problem with all this is we're talking about this as we're trying to fix a much greater problem with a tiny little change. The greater problem here is that our elections are so screwed up because of gerrymandering and because of campaign finance problems and because of the way primaries work, that somebody like a Kay Granger, you should be able to be like, hey, they've been there a long time, so I'm running against them, And so that's why we didn't used to have this problem, is because if you were there too long and your voters could tell, you would get voted out. And so I would say we should work on those things rather than try some big blanket solution that we know doesn't solve the actual problem we have.
Yeah, I'm open to any option, whether it's term limits, age limits, which I'm a little bit more sympathetic to. Or like if we just had a stronger set of norms of people leaving or being forced out when they're clearly past their prime. Like on our side of the aisle, it's Feinstein. It's like there should have just been way more push from people beyond the activists to say that she should leave. And it didn't fit neatly along the ideological line. There were people who were far left who were saying it. There were moderates who were saying it. I think it was just a lot of people saying like, you know what, like. But the true marker of the people who are saying it were the less ties you had to the establishment, whether it's the establishment far left progressives or the establishment moderates, the less you had skin in the game with the actual system, the more likely you were to call a spade and say, this person clearly can't do the job anymore. Yeah.
We had a term in the Army, which was ROAD. It was ROAD, retired on active duty. And, it wasn't very common, but every once in a while you'd see somebody who they had settled into their last rank. They had 3 years to go. They weren't going to get promoted. They just weren't pulling their own weight. They weren't working very hard. And so, but the thing is, in the Army, when that happens, you can be like, yeah, that person's road. Let's put them over here in a position where them being road is not going to impede us being an effective unit, right? Like we're not going to put them in charge of people. You unfortunately do not have that luxury in Congress for the most part. I mean, leadership can, put them in committee positions where they're less consequential, but it doesn't do anything for their district. So I just think, yes, you're right. You need more accountability within Congress, but it's not that I'm not opposed to term limits in the sense of what they're supposed to do. It's just that I have seen the actual unintended consequences of them. And I think that those are much worse than the benefits of them.
Yeah. I would almost come up with some, and maybe we could solve this issue in a number of ways, like a golden parachute for the Senate. And this could apply to anything, which is if you leave the Senate and of your own volition without standing for a re-election, and you do not take a lobbying job, and you can come up with a couple of categories, then your pension is higher or something. I don't know. Like you come up with a couple of incentives,
Here's the problem, Ravi. Where do you really think members of Congress being too old to be effective, where do you really think it ranks in terms of the biggest problems we have in the legislative branch of our government? Because I think it's like 15th.
Yeah, I agree that it's not that big. I mean, there have been some recent non-senatorial age issues that I think have been very important. And I think we're about to go through 4 years of massive cognitive decline after I think 4 years preceding it.
In that case, though, we have a term limit, but that's because of the immense power that a presidency, wields.
Yeah, and that's actually an argument against term limits because that ain't a term limit problem. That's an age limit problem, but also a problem. A lot of problems, let's just say, and the fact that we have 2 in a row probably should tell us something.
It's you know what? It's a good example of when you have a system that is not gerrymandered or rigged, you end up with a result like the party and the country came to the conclusion that Joe Biden was past his prime and that he wasn't able to do it anymore. And so what happened? He was politically forced out because he was going to lose by a lot. And so that's a good example of like, if we had districts that made sense, if we had a primary process that made sense, if we just had what we used to have, which is the ability for the majority of members of Congress to lose their reelection if they do a bad job, you would end up with a much better system.
Right. And this has been going on for a while, like FDR, Reagan. I mean, they all had different issues that were either shielded from the public or whatever, so I don't want to claim that this is uniquely of the moment. There are stats about how like our elected members are getting older and older and older. We have to account for the fact that people are living older too, but so it's probably complicated.
If you were going to do one or the other, I would much rather have the age limit than the term limit, because I've seen how when people get down there and they don't know how things work and they don't know that something's already been tried a bunch of times, it empowers the people who are paid to influence that legislative body like times 100.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, this was a fun week. Happy New Year.
You too, man.
What'd you do for New Year's Eve? You're in Costa Rica.
I went to bed early and woke up and surfed this morning, and there were jellyfish like fragments all in the water. So, and I was like deep out there because the waves were pretty big. And basically every time I would dip my feet in the water, which is unavoidable when you're surfing, it would be like massive sting. So I was stuck out in the water where it was basically like a horror movie. And the only way to escape it would be to catch a huge wave in, which I eventually did. But that was how I spent the morning.
How painful is a jellyfish sting?
I've never had a full-on live jellyfish sting, knock on wood, but this was just the fragments of the dead jellyfish, which, if that's any indication, I am not looking forward to what is an inevitable like full-on sting, which I heard is pretty bad. Yeah, but that's how I spent the morning, and then I had breakfast with a bunch of people, a lot of Harris Biden refugees who are in town. So,
that's interesting.
Yeah, so that was my morning.
It's funny, like I'm 43 years old. Diana and I were asleep by 11 last night, and then she let me sleep in. I woke up at 9, and ironically, because I use Whoop, I can look at my sleep score. It is the most sleep that I have gotten since 2023.
Oh my God.
That's how I've started 2025. But I struggle to get good sleep anyway. So I got 8 hours and 40 minutes of sleep, which is like a huge record for me, which is sad, but it is. So, I guess in a way that's a really good start to the year. So, all right. Thanks everybody for listening and for watching. Please leave a 5-star review. Thank you to the Meidas Mighty. Remember, we all have a platform. Make sure to use yours today.